The staircase inside the lighthouse hadn't been climbed in years, according to every official record. So when Sarah sat alone at the top and heard it creaking beneath her, one slow footstep at a time, she had to ask herself a question with no good answer. If the tower had truly sat empty since automation, whose weight was she hearing on those stairs right now? Weeks before that night, it had only taken her father's failing health to finally bring her back to the small coastal town she'd spent most of her adult life avoiding. Walter Bennett had worked as a lighthouse keeper for nearly 40 years along the rocky Maine coastline before automation eliminated his position, and even after the job ended, he never left the modest keeper's cottage that came with it, a squat wooden house perched on a bluff overlooking the water, close enough to the old lighthouse that its beam still swept across his bedroom window every night out of habit more than necessity. When his heart began failing that autumn, Sarah moved back to care for him, and during the final weeks of his life, he repeated one request so often that it became almost a ritual between them. He wanted her to promise that whatever happened to him, she would keep the cottage in the family, that she would never let it pass to strangers the way so much of the coastline had been sold off to developers over the years. Sarah promised, mostly to bring him comfort, never expecting the promise would come to matter as much as it eventually did. During those final visits, Walter rarely spoke about the cottage in ordinary terms, the way most people might reminisce about a home filled with everyday memories. Instead, he spoke almost exclusively about the lighthouse itself, asking Sarah more than once whether she remembered the exact rhythm of its beam sweeping across her childhood bedroom window, and whether she thought a light like that ever truly stopped mattering to a coastline, automated or not. Sarah had always assumed these were simply the wandering preoccupations of a man who had spent his working life devoted to a single structure, and she answered him gently each time without giving the questions much deeper thought. Walter passed away in late September, and Sarah found herself unable to leave afterward, partly out of grief and partly because something about breaking her promise so soon after making it felt unbearable. She took a leave of absence from her job in Boston and stayed in the cottage through the winter, telling herself she would sort out what to do with the property once she felt steadier. Her younger brother Mark drove up most weekends to help her go through their father's belongings, and for the first month, the process felt almost peaceful, a quiet, methodical way of saying goodbye. That peace ended abruptly in late October, when Sarah woke one night to the sound of the old brass ship's bell that had hung beside the cottage's front door for as long as she could remember, ringing steadily despite there being no wind strong enough to move it. She dismissed it at first, assuming a loose hinge or a gust she hadn't noticed, but the bell rang again the following night at almost exactly the same time, somewhere close to 11 o'clock, and continued ringing intermittently for nearly 10 minutes before falling silent. Mark heard it himself the next weekend and walked outside to investigate, only to find the bell hanging perfectly still, its clapper resting exactly where it always had, showing no sign that it had recently moved at all. He suggested it might be settling in the old wooden post the bell hung from, though neither of them fully believed the explanation. The ringing continued nightly through the first week of November, always around 11, always lasting roughly the same length of time, and always stopping the moment either of them stepped outside to check. What unsettled Sarah more than the bell itself was a pattern she began noticing in how the sound seemed to move. On some nights it rang steadily from directly outside the front door. On others it seemed to originate farther away, closer to the edge of the bluff where the old lighthouse stood, as though whatever was causing it were walking the property line between the cottage and the water. She began keeping a small notebook by her bed, recording the exact time and apparent direction of the ringing each night, and after nearly 2 weeks of documentation, a pattern emerged that she couldn't ignore. The sound was tracing the same route every single night, a path that led from the cottage's front door, along the narrow gravel walkway her father used to take each evening during his years as keeper, straight toward the lighthouse itself. Sarah mentioned this to Mark, and together they decided to walk the same path themselves one night, hoping that seeing it firsthand might offer some explanation the recordings in her notebook couldn't provide. They stood outside just before 11, flashlights ready, and when the bell began ringing exactly on schedule, they followed the sound as it seemed to move away from the cottage. It led them step by step down the gravel path toward the lighthouse, staying just far enough ahead that they never quite caught up to its source. When they reached the base of the lighthouse itself, the ringing stopped abruptly, and for a long moment neither of them moved, both staring up at the old structure their father had maintained for decades, wondering what exactly they had just followed there. The lighthouse itself had been decommissioned years earlier, its light replaced by an automated beacon mounted separately nearby, leaving the original tower unused except as a kind of monument to what the town used to be. The door at its base had been locked for as long as Sarah could remember, sealed by the Coast Guard when they handed maintenance over to automated systems, but when she tried the handle that night out of simple curiosity, it turned easily, swinging open with a groan that suggested it hadn't been properly secured in quite some time. Neither of them had brought anything more than flashlights, and neither felt prepared to climb the spiral staircase inside at that hour, so they left it for the following morning, latching the door shut behind them as best they could. When Sarah returned the next day with Mark and a borrowed flashlight strong enough to illuminate the stairwell properly, she discovered something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her father's final years. The lighthouse's interior, which should have sat completely untouched since decommissioning, showed clear signs of recent use. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces, consistent with years of neglect, but a narrow path free of dust wound up the spiral staircase, as though someone had been climbing it regularly enough to keep that portion clear. At the top, in the small circular room that once housed the original lamp mechanism, she found a folding chair set up facing the window that overlooked the water, along with a thermos, a stack of weathered paperback novels, and a small transistor radio that still had batteries inside when Mark checked. It took Sarah several days to work up the courage to ask their father's oldest friend in town, a retired fisherman named Gerald who had known Walter since childhood, whether he knew anything about the lighthouse being used after decommissioning. Gerald's reaction told her the question wasn't as simple as she had hoped. He grew quiet for a long moment before admitting that Walter had continued climbing the tower most nights for years after his official duties ended, a habit he never fully explained even to his closest friends. When Gerald had asked him about it once, years earlier, Walter had given an answer that Gerald never forgot, though he had always assumed it was simply the kind of eccentric thing old lighthouse keepers said. Walter told him he wasn't going up there out of nostalgia. He was going up there to keep watch, because someone needed to, and because the previous keeper, the man Walter had trained under decades earlier, had asked him to continue the practice before he died. That detail sent Sarah searching through old town records, trying to identify who exactly had kept the light before her father, and what she found deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The man who trained Walter, a keeper named Elias Grady, had died under circumstances the local paper from that era described only vaguely, mentioning an accident during a severe storm without specifying exactly what had happened. What the article didn't mention, but what Sarah eventually found buried in a Maritime Historical Society archive after several more days of digging, was that Elias Grady's body had never actually been recovered. He had vanished during the storm along with a fishing vessel that ran aground near the point that same night, and the official record simply assumed he had been swept out to sea while attempting to warn the boat away from the rocks. No body, no confirmed cause of death, only an assumption written into the historical record as fact because no better explanation ever presented itself. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the nightly ringing, the worn path up the lighthouse stairs, and her father's decades-long habit of climbing that same tower were all connected to something Elias Grady had left unfinished the night he disappeared. She returned to the lighthouse that evening, alone this time, determined to sit in the same chair her father had used and wait to see if anything happened. Mark objected strongly, but Sarah insisted, telling him she needed to understand what her father had spent years quietly protecting before she could decide what to do with either the cottage or the lighthouse itself. Before climbing that evening, Sarah spent nearly an hour at the cottage sorting through a box of her father's belongings she hadn't yet had the strength to open, hoping she might find some written record of his own thoughts on the tower and its history. Most of the box contained ordinary paperwork, old maintenance receipts, and decades of tide charts, but tucked near the bottom she found a small leather notebook filled with Walter's handwriting, dated across several decades, containing brief nightly entries that read almost identically to the kind of professional log a working keeper might once have kept, despite the fact that Walter had officially retired from the position years before many of the entries were written. The final entry, dated only weeks before his heart failure worsened, simply read that the light still needed tending, and that he hoped, when the time came, someone would understand why. She climbed the tower just before dusk, settling into the folding chair as the last light faded over the water. And for nearly 2 hours nothing happened beyond the ordinary sounds of wind and waves against the rocks below. Then, close to 11 o'clock, she heard the ship's bell begin ringing back at the cottage, distant but unmistakable, exactly on schedule. Moments later she heard something new, a slow, deliberate creaking from the spiral staircase beneath her, as though someone were climbing the tower one careful step at a time. Sarah sat frozen in the chair, watching the opening where the staircase met the small circular room, and though she never saw anything emerge from the darkness below, the creaking continued steadily upward until it reached the final step, directly outside the doorway, and then stopped. As the creaking drew closer, the temperature in the small room dropped hard enough that Sarah could see her own breath, and the last 2 steps came slower than the rest, drawn out, deliberate, as though whatever was climbing wanted her to hear every single one of them individually before it reached the top. For nearly a full minute nothing happened. Then, quietly, almost too soft to hear over the wind, a voice spoke from just beyond the doorway. It wasn't threatening, and it wasn't loud. It simply said that the light needed tending, the same phrase Sarah later learned from Gerald, that lighthouse keepers along that stretch of coast had used for generations as an unofficial changing of the watch, spoken whenever one keeper relieved another at the end of a shift. Sarah didn't respond. She sat perfectly still until the presence, whatever it had been, seemed to withdraw, the creaking staircase settling back into silence, the bell at the cottage falling quiet at almost the exact same moment. She descended the tower shortly afterward and found Mark waiting anxiously outside, having heard nothing himself despite standing at the base the entire time. When she described what she had experienced, he suggested, gently, that grief and exhaustion could easily produce experiences that felt entirely real without actually being so. Sarah didn't argue, though privately she found it difficult to believe that grief alone could account for the worn path on the staircase, the thermos and radio left behind by a man who had died decades before her father was born, or the ship's bell that continued ringing on a schedule too precise to be coincidental. In the days immediately following that night, Sarah found herself returning to the Maritime Historical Society archive, no longer satisfied with the vague official account of Elias Grady's disappearance. She requested access to the Society's original correspondence files, boxes of unsorted letters and shift logs that had never been fully cataloged, and after several afternoons spent sorting through brittle paper and faded ink, she found something that gave the encounter in the lighthouse a far more specific shape than she had expected. Among the correspondence was a series of letters exchanged between Elias Grady and the Regional Lighthouse Authority in the years leading up to his disappearance, in which Grady repeatedly requested permission to train a successor, expressing what the letters described as a growing concern that he wouldn't always be able to maintain the light himself. The authorities' replies were dismissive, treating the requests as unnecessary given Grady's relative youth and good health, and the correspondence ended abruptly the same month the storm took him. What struck Sarah most wasn't the request itself, but a line in Grady's final letter, written only weeks before the storm, in which he described a specific fear that had apparently been troubling him for some time. He wrote that a keeper's duty didn't end simply because a shift had ended badly, and that he intended to find some way to ensure the light was never truly left untended, regardless of what happened to him personally. At the time, the regional authority had apparently read this as ordinary professional dedication. Reading it now, decades later, Sarah found it difficult not to interpret it as something closer to a vow, one that Grady seemed to have kept in whatever form remained available to him after the storm took his life. She brought the letters to Gerald, hoping he might have additional context passed down through the fishing community that hadn't made it into any official archive. Gerald read through the pages slowly, his expression growing more troubled with each one, and when he finally looked up, he admitted something he said he had never told anyone, including Walter, during all their years of friendship. His own grandfather had served on one of the last crews stationed near that lighthouse before automation, and had once mentioned, only in passing and only after several drinks, that keepers along that stretch of coast used to speak of an unofficial arrangement passed down through each generation. Whoever trained under a keeper was expected, upon that keeper's death, to continue climbing the tower on the anniversary of significant storms, a quiet gesture of respect that had nothing to do with any actual maintenance need and everything to do with honoring the dangers the job had always carried. Gerald said his grandfather described the practice as dying out gradually as automation took hold, with fewer and fewer keepers remaining who even knew the tradition existed. If Walter had learned this tradition from Grady himself during his training, and had continued it faithfully for decades after Grady's death, it would explain both his insistence on climbing the tower long after his official duties ended, and his refusal to fully explain the habit even to those closest to him. It also suggested something Sarah hadn't previously considered, that the presence she encountered on the stairs that night might not have been confined to Elias Grady alone, but might represent something closer to an accumulated weight of every keeper who had ever kept that particular promise, layered over decades until the boundary between one man's memory and the tower's own history had become impossible to separate. Sarah brought this theory back to Gerald once more, and this time he offered something he admitted he probably should have mentioned sooner. He recalled that his grandfather had once described the tradition as carrying a specific condition, one that had always struck him as strange even by the standards of old maritime superstition. A keeper who inherited the duty from his predecessor was expected to continue the nightly watch, not indefinitely, but until he had properly trained someone else to take his place, at which point the responsibility, and whatever quiet presence accompanied it, was meant to transfer fully to the new keeper. Gerald's grandfather had always assumed this simply meant an orderly handoff between working keepers, the kind of thing any profession might practice informally. But sitting with Sarah's account of what had happened in the tower, he found himself wondering aloud whether the tradition had a more literal meaning than anyone in his family had ever considered, whether the presence itself, whatever it truly was, remained bound to the tower only until a successor had been properly acknowledged, and simply continued waiting, patiently and indefinitely, whenever that handoff never occurred. Walter had never formally trained anyone before his death, a fact Sarah confirmed easily enough, since neither she nor Mark had ever expressed interest in the lighthouse during his lifetime, and no one else in town had ever apprenticed under him in any official capacity. If Gerald's theory held any truth, it meant Walter had likely spent his final years fully aware that his own watch would end without a clear successor, and Sarah began to wonder whether some of his insistence that she keep the cottage in the family had been less about sentimental attachment to the property itself, and more about ensuring someone remained nearby who might eventually, even unknowingly, continue what he had never gotten the chance to properly pass along. That theory settled uneasily alongside a detail Sarah hadn't shared with anyone yet, something she had noticed only days after her encounter, but had been reluctant to mention even to Mark. The folding chair she had sat in that night, the same one that had apparently belonged to her father during his own nightly visits, had been positioned facing the window toward the water when she first found it. After her encounter, she found it turned instead to face the doorway, angled toward the spiral staircase, as though whatever had occupied it that night were no longer watching the sea, but watching instead for whoever might next climb those stairs to take up the same quiet duty. In the weeks that followed, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her brother. Rather than selling the property or abandoning the lighthouse entirely, she arranged with the local historical society to formally maintain the structure, ensuring someone would continue climbing the tower regularly, keeping watch the way keepers along that coast always had, whether or not anyone could explain exactly why the tradition still seemed to matter. She never experienced the presence on the stairs again after that first night, and the ship's bell gradually grew quieter over the following months until it stopped ringing altogether by spring. Sarah still isn't entirely sure what she encountered that night in the lighthouse, whether it was truly Elias Grady continuing a duty interrupted nearly a century earlier, or something else entirely that had simply borrowed his voice and his habits to ensure the tower was never left unwatched. What she does know is that her father spent decades honoring a request he never fully explained, climbing those stairs night after night long after any practical reason to do so had disappeared, and that whatever compelled him to keep that promise seemed to recognize and accept when Sarah finally chose to continue it in his place. Mark returned to Boston that winter, unwilling to spend another season so close to something he couldn't rationalize. But Sarah found herself reluctant to leave the coast at all, eventually giving up her apartment in the city entirely and settling into the keeper's cottage full-time. She took a remote position with her old firm, restructuring her life around a place she had spent most of her adulthood trying to escape, and told herself the decision had more to do with grief and simplicity than with any lingering sense of obligation toward a tower she barely understood. Even so, she found herself walking the gravel path toward the lighthouse most evenings, whether or not the bell had rung the night before, standing at its base for a few quiet minutes before returning to the cottage. The Historical Society, thrilled to have a local resident willing to take on regular upkeep, eventually offered Sarah a modest stipend to serve as the tower's unofficial caretaker, a role that involved little more than occasional cleaning and reporting any structural concerns to the appropriate county office. She accepted, partly for the income, and partly because it gave her a legitimate reason to keep climbing the stairs without having to explain to curious volunteers why she seemed so drawn to a decommissioned lighthouse that no longer served any practical purpose. During her third spring in the role, a new volunteer, a college student researching the region's maritime history for a thesis project, asked Sarah directly whether she had ever heard any of the old stories about the tower being haunted. Sarah told her no, choosing the lie easily, and redirected the conversation toward the tower's construction date instead. That same spring, cleaning out a storage closet on the ground floor that hadn't been opened in years, Sarah discovered a second folding chair, identical to the one she had found upstairs, tucked behind stacks of old maintenance records. She had no memory of it being there during her earlier visits, and when she asked Gerald, now well into his 80s but still sharp, whether he knew anything about a second chair, he simply shrugged and said that some keepers preferred company during long shifts, and that it wasn't unusual, in the old days, for two men to share the watch on particularly rough nights. Sarah didn't ask him to elaborate further. She carried the second chair upstairs herself the following week and set it beside the first, facing the same window toward the water, and she has never mentioned to anyone why she felt it belonged there. The lighthouse still stands on that bluff today, its light automated and its tower open only to the Historical Society volunteers who maintain it. And though most of them dismiss the old ship's bell as nothing more than a quirky piece of local history, Sarah has never volunteered for the overnight maintenance shifts, and she has never told anyone exactly why. 2 nights ago, the college volunteer texted her a photo taken during a routine inspection, apologizing for the blurry quality and asking if the second chair was supposed to be facing the window like that. In the photo, both chairs sat side by side exactly where Sarah had left them, facing the water. Except the second one wasn't empty anymore. Something was sitting in it, indistinct, more shadow than shape, and it was turned toward the camera. Sarah still hasn't answered the text.